Welcome back to Umzansi Welcomes the World. We are on day 2 of the B20 Summit. And let me welcome my next guest, a East African compatriot of ours within the continent. She is the president of the International Organization of Employers. Let me welcome Ms. Jacqueline Mugo. Ms. Jacqueline, thank you so much for joining us here on Hilaal TV.
It's a pleasure for me to be here this morning to speak on behalf of employers on the sidelines of the B20 meeting.
No, it's an absolute pleasure having you on. You were part, of course, of the first panel yesterday morning. When we speak of Africa's G20 presidency, I know South Africa is hosting it, but I'd like to think of it as being Africa's G20 presidency. How honored should us as the continent be that we have taken an important block and have led it with such distinction?
This is a landmark event for Africa as a whole. And from the time that South Africa became the president and we knew they were going to chair this meeting, they made it very clear that it was going to be an African event. As you know, South Africa is the only African country that's amongst the G20. So for us, it's an African affair, and they made every effort to bring every voice on board to look at the landscape of business in the African continent. And it gives us a unique opportunity to bring the African voice to these international discussions so that when there is policy and there are policy debates and developments in the world, they can look at how it impacts the African continent, because everybody says that Africa is where the future is. And yet the investments and the policies and the priorities don't always reflect the priorities and the needs that Africa has as a continent.
Jacqueline, I want to touch on private sector discussions. Of course, you represent employers, and a lot of it is down to the private sector within Africa. In your view, what is the status of the private sector within Africa? Because what's beautiful about Africa is that we're not short of any raw materials. We are not short of every natural resource, from coffee, which of course Kenya, leads, from beans to oil to gold to gas. Africa has it. In your view, in the discussions you have with the private sector, how are we looking from a continental perspective in terms of trade?
Well, I speak on behalf of a body, the International Organization of Employers, that represents the private sector globally. We have over 150 employer and business member federations that are members of IOE. And together we represent over 50 million companies. But Africa has a special place in that landscape because we are a developing continent. We have many challenges: interconnectivity, the infrastructure in the continent, the fact that we have a lot of resources, but it's not seen, it has not translated into a change on the ground to change the lives of the ordinary people. So the private sector in Africa operates under a fairly difficult and challenging environment. We are looking at issues of skills development in the continent and how fragmented that is and how disconnected it is from the real needs of the labor market. So Africa needs to invest a lot in skills development to be able to upskill our people to operate in this new world of data, of technology, of digitalization. Africa has a trade problem because we have the Continental Free Trade Area Agreement, which is unique. It has many opportunities, but we have not realized the benefits yet because we have a lot of non-tariff barriers. Then when you look at Africa, we have regulations, a very unpredictable regulatory space where governments increasingly are putting a heavy burden on businesses. Businesses can plan and are committed to being compliant with the regulations. But if there is no stability in the policy and regulatory environment, then the private sector in Africa is always under stress. Finally, look at the productivity of the enterprises, the real enterprises in the African continent. It's very low. So we need to invest in that because the structure of the market in Africa is largely informal. So the private sector is actually quite small. When you look at the totality of the market. So we need to address the issue of informality, which is being done, but not fast enough. So these unique challenges and opportunities that Africa has is what brings the voice of business and makes it very important for governments and for policymakers to listen to employers so that together we can work to address these issues, to enhance the speed of growth in the continent so that that growth also translates into employment opportunities, which is a big issue for us as well.
You know what's interesting or what you mentioned, because it's an international framework. Let's take a look at African countries and the way they trade with Europe. It's much higher in terms of percentage. Intra-Africa trade sits at 17%. You were on that panel discussion yesterday, and what was interesting is that there's such a discussion from a deliberation perspective, I beg your pardon, which saying more has to be done within the continent. President Cyril Ramaphosa has mentioned it. More needs to be done within the continent. But how close or how far are we to saying that 17% needs to make a huge increase? Because if Africa is going to thrive, it has to thrive with the trade being more relaxed, but also the opportunities needs to be much more.
It is true that Africa can do a lot with herself and within herself. The 17% level of trade is very low. This is what the Continental Free Trade Area Agreement was supposed to address. But we get countries at policy level, at the AU level, making these commitments politically, but on the ground, there are a lot of non-tariff barriers. Look at the ease of movement within the continent, for one. Some countries have tried to remove barriers to entry into their countries. We've been talking about an Africa-wide passport to make it easier for connectivity within the continent, because it's really quite sad that to go to West Africa, I have to go to Dubai or France sometimes to end up in Senegal. It does not make sense. So we need to make it possible for us to move within the continent, and also freedom in terms of entry and exit, and remove these hurdles that we have put in each other's ways. And Africa also needs to look at the resources that we have to be able to trade better with one another, because we're all exporting to Europe, to America, to the rest of the world, items and products that could benefit the continent and enhance the growth and productivity within the continent. So this potential is something that is unexploited and yet remains there latent, waiting. We don't need to be fighting the US for changing, some of these trade rules, which is important, but it's a very small segment of trade. So Africa is sitting, I think, on a big opportunity, which we hope that events such as this would unlock. And there would be fresh commitment for us to be honest with each other, to trust each other, and to look at the continent as one, and to use that as leverage for negotiating when you go to international forums.
Jacqueline, today and yesterday, we've seen representatives from the US business coming through. I don't want to get to the political side. Obviously, it's difficult to separate that because business and administrations work hand in hand for the growth of their respective countries. But seeing US businesses here, from your perspective, Jacqueline, from how you are seeing things, is there a sense of confidence that you can look at and say, well, if the US business is here, it means they want to do business, not just with South Africa, but with the rest of the continent? Obviously, the big sticking point is that of the government that is sitting in Washington, D.C. How have you analyzed this, Jacqueline? We've had somebody come from Microsoft. We've had somebody from the United States Chamber of Commerce. Those are two massive organizations coming from the most powerful economy in the world.
From a business perspective, I would say the business community in America is trying to do what they can, and it has been involved in a lot of discussions to make it possible for that trade to continue. They're very interested in doing business with the African continent, and they are part of the business community that the International Organization of Employers leads. So at business level, I do not see any barriers. But of course, business needs political goodwill. So we're still hoping that there would be a breakthrough in that, because the US is the next president of the G20 and the B20 discussions. And from what I know, that's going to happen. But we are hoping that the world would trade better with itself. The US needs the rest of the world, and the rest of the world needs the US. So these conversations that happen at political level, we don't really get involved in, but they impact business. So what we're trying to do is see how we can bring the business voice to the conversation, so that when political decisions are made, there is a very strong realization and appreciation of the impact it has on real lives on the ground, on the state of business, and on the capacity of the world to address some of the challenges that we face and the aspirations that we have in the SDGs, for instance. So it's a very important indication for us to see the business community here, and we're hoping that that will then be the springboard to bring in the political element as well.
Jacqueline, I've got 1 minute left. In your view, in the summary of Jacqueline Mugo, how would you sum up the B20 and the G20 lead of South Africa? Your minute starts now.
South Africa has done an excellent job in leading the B20 and the G20 discussions. They brought all voices to the table. This particular event, the B20, will come up with very clear conclusions and outcomes which will be practical, implementable by all the parties that are involved. We as a business community are very appreciative of the work that they've done, and part of our members have been in the planning. Many of us have been involved in the task forces, in the skills and education task force, and all the others. So I think it's a great opportunity, and they've done some excellent work and laid the background for the next chair of the B20 and G20 to build on. But Africa's voice has been heard, and Africa is the place where it's happening. So we are in it together to push for what we need as Africa to take us to the next level.
Jacqueline Mugo, absolute pleasure having you on. Thank you so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
Absolute pleasure. That's Jacqueline Mugo from the International Federation of Employers. She serves as its president. We'll wrap up today's proceedings at the B20 Summit on Mzansi Welcomes the World. Do stay tuned.